The wind came first sharp and dry, pushing under the cabin door and rattling the warped panes before the sky had even begun to pale. I stepped outside into that half-dark where shapes are still uncertain and the land holds its breath before daybreak. Out beyond the porch, the barn door rocked against its hinge open, just enough for the wind to toy with. I hadn't left it that way. My boots crunched over the frozen ground as I crossed the yard, one hand brushing the stock of the rifle I hadn't bothered to bring. I pressed my palm to the rough wood and eased it open. Inside, in the straw and shadows, 5 women sat close together. Barefoot, bruised, their faces lifted toward me in silence. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever stood at a crossroads where one choice could change everything. My name's Flint McAllen. I've worked this spread alone for near 15 years. A narrow patch of cattle land pressed up against the red cliffs of Cold Mesa. I came here after the war, thinking the distance might quiet the noise I carried. It never truly did. I was raised in a place where a man's worth was measured in his word, where you fed strangers at your table and rode 2 miles out of your way to check on a neighbor's fence. We had little money growing up, just a milk cow, a small garden, and the kind of faith that meant Sundays were for church and the rest of the week was for honest labor. The Mesa country was harder. Out here, the wind will strip paint off a wall before it ever eases a summer afternoon. Water's always worth more than silver, and men will gamble away both in the saloons. The railroad men talk about progress while buying up homesteads from widows for pennies on the acre. I kept to myself, mending what could be mended, letting the rest go. A burned-out shell of a house on the West Ridge still stands where my wife and I lived before the fire. I've never torn it down. Each season the herd grew smaller, the mornings quieter. I'd rise before first light the stove pull on my boots, and step into a yard where the only sounds were my own. The chickens clucked soft in the coop, the mare shifted her weight in the stall, and that was the measure of my day. I thought that was all there would be, until the morning I saw that barn door move in the wind. I knew enough of the territory to tell when something was out of place. I also knew trouble didn't always announce itself loud. The women inside didn't move to speak, didn't try to run, just sat among the hay as if they'd been there for hours. The eldest met my eyes, steady as stone. There was a story there, though it wasn't mine to pull from them. I stepped back into the cold and let the door fall to. By the time I crossed back to the cabin, the sun was pushing a thin light over the cliffs. The kettle hissed on the stove, and I set bread and beans on the table without really thinking why. Sometimes a man acts before he counts the cost. I cut the bread thick, set the food on a tray, and reached for the spare blanket hanging by the door. I paused there, listening to the wind slide around the eaves, knowing full well that whatever I did next might change the quiet I'd lived with for years. I picked up the tray, stepped outside, and started back toward the barn. The ground was still frozen hard when I crossed the yard again, carrying the tray and blanket toward the barn. Frost clung to the edges of the grass, and the boards under my boots creaked in the cold. I eased the door open just far enough to slide the tray inside, setting it on a low crate. The women stayed where they were, close together, the eldest watching every move I made. Not a word passed between us. I stepped back, pulled the door shut, and stood there in the wind for a long moment before heading toward the cabin. The next morning, the tray was empty, the blanket gone. The latch on the barn door had been fastened from the inside. I worked the day, as I always did, hauling water patching fence, but my eyes drifted to that barn more than once. Later, I left a pot of stew on the porch at dusk. By the time I stepped outside again, it was gone. The same thing happened the next night. On the third day, I found a bundle of wild herbs wrapped neatly in cloth by the chicken coop. The trough had been scrubbed clean and the feed scattered just so. They were keeping their distance, but they were helping. On the fourth morning, I saw the eldest standing in the yard. She had her arms crossed against the chill, her face set. "You going to run us off?" she asked, her voice even. I shook my head. "No." Her brow furrowed slightly. "Why not?" I didn't have an answer I cared to share, so I just said, "Don't see a reason to." She gave a short nod and stepped back into the barn. By the week's end, they began to appear in small ways. One of them, slight, with a quiet smile, worked near the fence line, clearing brush and gathering bits of wildflower. Another, the smallest, moved barefoot between barn and coop, tightening hinges with twine and nails she must have found in some forgotten tin. A taller woman, her hand wrapped in cloth, patched the chicken wire and sorted nails without being asked. The youngest sat under the porch rail, sewing little cloth dolls, her humming barely louder than the wind. That evening, I pulled an extra bench from the barn and set it on the porch. When I went inside, the stew pot on the stove was already full bread warm on the table. They came in together, faces clean, shoulders straighter than the first day I'd seen them. They didn't linger with their eyes on the floor. We ate without talk, passing the bread and the pot from hand to hand. By the next morning, the fire was already burning when I woke. Kindling had been gathered, and the kettle was steaming. Through the small window, I saw the youngest at the well, her hands red from the cold water as she cleaned a bowl of potatoes. I stepped outside and walked over, but she didn't pause her work. "You cold?" I asked. She gave a small shake of her head. Later, I left a thick shawl folded on the porch rail. She didn't say a word about it. That afternoon, the eldest came to the fence where I was mending a rail. She stood a few paces off, watching me work. "We'll work," she said after a time. I nodded. "I know." She shifted her weight. "You're wondering if we'll leave?" I met her eyes. "Only if you want to." Her gaze stayed steady. "Not unless we have to." I asked her name. "Ayanna," she said. I told her mine, though. I think she already knew it from the brand on the old mare's saddle. The women moved into their own rhythm after that. Sonny, with her braid loose down her back, tended to the patch of earth near the fence. Tula, the barefoot one, made short work of repairs, never minding the cold ground. Mika, the one with her hand wrapped, kept the animals fed and the barn in order. Wren stayed close to the cabin, sewing and mending, without being told. I noticed how they kept to themselves, not out of rudeness, but as if safety was still in question. That evening, as the sun bled orange across the cliffs, I set out a second bench beside the door. When I came back in, the stew pot was bubbling. They gathered one by one, Ayanna taking the place across from me. I asked her where they were from. She looked up. "South," she said. "Beyond the cliffs. A place no one names anymore." It was enough of an answer. After a long pause, she spoke again. "We were taken, held for trade, for worse." Her voice didn't shake, but her hands were still. My jaw tightened, though I kept my eyes on the table. "Whoever had you, they looking?" She shrugged slightly. "Maybe. Don't know if they care enough to come this far." I told her if they did, they wouldn't get far. She didn't thank me, and I didn't expect her to. That night I lay awake, listening to the quiet breathing in the cabin. Wren shifted now and then, clutching the doll she'd made. I thought about how they had appeared here, not by accident, and how the land felt different with them on it. It wasn't the kind of change you planned for. The days that followed carried small changes. Ayanna sometimes walked the fence line, a length of rope over her shoulder. Sonny began planting in the dirt rows she'd marked, watering with dishwater and guarding the soil from the wind with stones. Tula moved from hinge to latch, fixing what was loose. Mika worked the barn in silence, though I saw the bruises on her wrists fading. Wren stitched at the window, her hum a constant thread in the air. One afternoon, Ayanna came by as I was tightening the shed latch. She stopped a few feet away. "You the oldest?" I asked. She nodded. "You pulled them out yourself." I did. She looked toward the cabin, her jaw tightening. They were going to be split up, traded one at a time. I had to get them out. She told me of half-drunk traders, one of them, a former cavalry hand who saw Apache women as something to pass around. My grip on the wrench bit into my palm. She looked at me hard. "Then you know why we're not going back." I told her I wouldn't let them. That night I dug into a corner of the storage shed, pulling out 2 old rifles I hadn't touched in years. I cleaned them until the rust gave way to steel and set them by the door, loaded and ready. The next day, Sonny came to me while I was filling the trough. "You think they'll come?" she asked. I didn't lie. "If they do, it won't be for kindness." She nodded once. "Then we'll be ready." That evening, the women moved about the porch and yard with a quiet purpose. Ayanna sat on the top step, her knife working against a length of wood. Sonny kept watch near the fence. Tula cleaned a bucket with sand, and Wren stayed inside sewing. I stood in the doorway watching them as the light faded, knowing the ranch wasn't mine alone anymore. The wind dropped after sundown, leaving the land still enough that even the smallest sound carried. It was the kind of night when hoofbeats could be heard from miles away, and I found myself glancing toward the dark line of the ridge. The air was sharp enough to bite the skin when I stepped outside before first light. The yard was still the frost, turning every blade of grass pale under the moon. The fire inside had burned low, but I could see a faint glow from the barn where someone had stoked embers during the night. By the time I reached it, Ayanna was already there, standing just beyond the open door. She didn't turn when I came up beside her. "Tracks," she said, her voice low. I followed her gaze to the southeast edge of the property where the ground dipped toward the ridge. In the faint gray light, the marks were clear, narrow hoof prints pressed deep in the soil. Not from any ranch horse I knew. I crouched and brushed a gloved hand along the edge of one print. The dirt was still loose from the weight, the shape sharp and clean. 2, maybe 3, she added. I straightened and scanned the horizon. The sky was still closed over with night, but the land felt braced, as if it knew something was coming. "You tell the others," I asked. She shook her head. "Not yet. They'll need to hear it from both of us." We gathered in the cabin after breakfast. The steam from coffee rose between us as I told them what Ayanna had found. No one panicked. Mika leaned forward, elbows on her knees, listening without blinking. Sonny kept her eyes on the window. Even Wren, quiet as ever, moved closer to Tula's side and stayed there. Ayanna's voice was steady when she said, "We're not leaving again." The others nodded without question. That day, work turned from tending chores to shoring up what could be defended. Tula went straight to the barn, reinforcing the side window with an iron rod pulled from an old wagon frame. Dust clung to her bare feet, and she ignored the way her toes curled against the cold boards. Mika ran a length of wire along the front gate, fixing it to nails driven into the fence posts, a makeshift warning that would rattle if pulled. She also laid out every blade they had on the table, sharpening each until the edge caught the light. Sonny moved to the small garden she'd started near the fence. Her hands trembled as she dug up seedlings and placed them into rough clay pots she made from broken crockery and scrap wood. "They'll need water," she murmured to no one in particular. Ayanna spent most of the afternoon with her knife and a flat stone, shaping a length of wood into a point sharp enough to pierce hide. Wren sat by the hearth, tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick, her eyes far away. By sundown, they were outside near the fire pit together, for the first time since they'd come. The glow lit their faces, each one marked by old bruises and new resolve. Ayanna's knife whispered over the wood. Mika passed a tin flask between them. Sonny stacked the rocks she'd gathered earlier into neat piles at her side. Tula sat with her hands resting on her knees, fingers curled into loose fists. I stood just beyond the circle of light, the rifle hanging loose in my hands. Sonny spoke first, her voice level. I was 10 the first time someone tried to take me. She didn't look up as she said it. My uncle stopped him, broke his neck for it, got himself shot. She took a swallow from the flask and passed it on. No one told her to stop. Ayana's eyes lifted to meet mine across the fire. If they come again, we don't hide. We make them understand this isn't a place they can pass through. Mika's answer was a simple, we make them afraid. Tula said nothing, but the muscle in her jaw worked tight. That night I stayed on the porch. The oil lamp burned low, casting light over the steps. Ayana came out after a while, settling beside me without a word. We watched the land in silence. The wind had gone, leaving the night unnaturally still. After a long time, she asked, "Why'd you let us stay?" I kept my eyes on the ridge, because I know what it's like when no one comes. She didn't reply right away, but after a moment she reached down and picked up the spare rifle leaning against the bench. She rested it across her knees, and together we kept watch until the first pale streak of dawn. Morning brought a sky heavy with low clouds and a faint mist clinging to the ridge. The fire inside was already lit when I stepped in the smell of coffee mingling with damp wool. Ayana was by the window, her rifle strapped across her back. Ren sat cross-legged near the hearth, stitching with thread so fine it caught the light in her small fingers. I asked if she was all right. Her voice was barely a whisper. "If they come back, will you give us up?" I told her no. She nodded once and bent back over her sewing. Ayana walked the fence line again that afternoon, Sani following a few steps behind with a pouch of rocks at her hip. When I joined them, Ayana didn't turn. Still nothing, she said. "They'll wait until they think we've gone soft again." Her words carried no fear, only a fact she'd learned the hard way. That evening, I saddled the old mare and rode to where the main trail curved near the eastern slope. I buried a narrow tin pan under gravel and tied an empty bottle to it with wire enough to make a sharp sound if someone passed that way. On the ride back, the light had gone out of the sky, and the land lay in that strange pause before full dark. Ayana was back on the porch when I returned, a blade in her hands. "You ever lose someone?" she asked as I stepped up. "My wife," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "I lost a brother and a sister. Same fire, different hands." Neither of us spoke after that. Inside, a sudden burst of laughter broke the stillness, short and surprised. I saw Ayana glance toward the door. "They didn't laugh like that," before she said quietly. That night, I took the first watch. The wind stayed low, carrying only the creak of wood and the faint rustle from the barn. Somewhere past midnight, the bottle clinked a small sound, but enough. I rose rifle in hand and moved to the barn to watch the bend in the trail through a narrow crack in the wall. 2 riders moved there, slow and deliberate, their shapes sliding through the moonlight. Not traders. Not settlers. Men who knew how to take without asking. I closed the hatch, locked the barn, and walked back to the cabin. Ayana was already standing by the hearth, rifle in hand. Mika laced her boots at the door. Sani crouched near the window, Tula at the back wall with her knife. Ren sat close to the fire, the doll in her hands. "They're here," I said. Ayana's eyes narrowed. "How far?" "Half a mile. Moving slow." She nodded. "They'll come just before sunup." We began to ready what we had: 12 rounds for my rifle, a revolver with 6 2-knives, and the old shotgun Mika had cleaned. "We only shoot if we have to," I told them. "If they talk, we listen. But we don't open the door unless we mean to hold it." Sonny didn't look away from the glass. "What if they ask for us by name?" "Then I tell them you're not here." Ayana's reply came quick. "They won't believe it." "They don't need to." The cabin grew quiet as we settled in to wait. Outside, the land stayed still under the weight of night. Somewhere beyond the ridge, 3 riders closed the distance, and every breath inside those walls grew slow and measured. The sky was beginning to gray when the first sound of hoofbeats came up the trail. They were slow and steady, each one carrying across the still air. Inside the cabin, no one moved, though every set of eyes was alert. I stood by the door with the rifle, feeling the weight of it balanced in my hands. Ayanna was at the window watching the yard. Mika had the shotgun resting across her knees near the back wall. Sonny crouched where she could see both the porch and the ridge beyond. Tula's grip on her knife was tight, the point turned toward the floor. Wren sat close to the hearth, the doll in her lap, but her gaze fixed on the door. The riders came into view just as the first light reached the mesa. 3 men, 2 mounted, 1 on foot, stopped a few paces from the porch. The one on foot wore a long coat and had the kind of posture that told you he was used to being the one in control. His eyes were bloodshot, but his voice was steady when he called out, "Old man, we're looking for something came through here. Might have been Apache women. Don't much care which." I stayed still for a moment before answering. "Ain't seen anyone." His mouth curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Liar. You can move on, or we can settle it now." The boards under my feet groaned as I stepped outside, keeping the rifle low but ready. "This land don't belong to you," I said. Another knock came harder this time, though I was already on the porch. The leader's gaze slid over my shoulder toward the barn. "That's a lot of talk for one man." Ayanna stepped out behind me, rifle raised. Sonny followed, then Mika and Tula. They stood shoulder to shoulder without a word. The man's smirk faded his glance, moving from one face to the next. "You'd kill over them?" he asked. "No," I said. "I'd kill for what's right. They're part of that." His jaw tightened and he spat into the dirt. "You'll regret this." "No," I told him I won't. He backed up a step, then another, before swinging into the saddle. The others followed their horses, turning toward the ridge. We watched until they were little more than shapes against the horizon, the sound of hooves fading. Only when the dust had settled did Ayanna lower her rifle. We went back inside without a word. Wren crossed the room and clutched my coat in both hands. I rested a palm lightly on her back until her grip loosened. The cabin was quiet except for the scrape of Mika checking the latches on the shutters. Sonny poured water into a cup, her hands trembling. Tula leaned against the wall, her knife still in her fist. No one smiled. The air felt heavier than it had when the day began. We had held the line, but the weight of what could have happened lingered in the room. Ayanna joined me on the porch a short while later. The wind had picked up just enough to stir the dust in the yard. "They'll be back," she said. "Maybe with more." I nodded once. "I know." She glanced toward the ridge. "Do you regret it?" I kept my eyes on the trail. "I've made decisions I regret. This ain't one of them." Her gaze softened slightly. "Neither is staying." That afternoon I went out to mend a section of fence near the east trail. The sun was high, the air dry enough to crack the earth under my boots. Wren walked out with a folded cloth in her hands. She set it on the fence post beside me and stepped back. Inside was a biscuit, still warm. I looked at her. "You made this?" She gave one short nod. "It's good," I said after a bite. Her mouth twitched at the corners before she turned and walked back toward the cabin. By evening, the rhythm of the place had returned in small, careful ways. Mika cleaned the cooking pots. Tula let Sonny tend to the blisters on her feet without protest. Ayanna sat at the table working her blade against a whetstone. I asked where she learned to hold a rifle like she had that morning. "My father," she answered. "He taught you." "Taught my brothers." I watched. Her eyes stayed on the steel as she spoke. "They still around?" She paused. "No." That night I pulled an old map from the shelf and spread it across the table. They came from the southeast. Fort Ellison's a few days' ride that way. Could be others behind them, could be they were on their own. Ayanna leaned over the map. They weren't alone, even if they came in threes. I tapped the mesa's edge. We're here. Next water's 15 miles. Next helps twice that. If they come again, we won't see them until they're close. Mika's voice came from behind me. Then, we stay ready. The next morning, the work was different. Sani hauled stones to brace the chicken coop posts. Tula built a stronger brace for the barn window. Mika and Ayanna filled every barrel and trough on the property. I spent hours in the root cellar clearing the back tunnel in case we needed a way out. Ren fed the chickens and checked each one moving with a quiet confidence I hadn't seen before. That evening, Ayanna stood in the west field, hands in her pockets, watching the sun fall behind the cliffs. I joined her, the smell of dry grass in the air. "You've built something here," she said without turning. "Wasn't much before you came," I told her. "It's not just the house," she said. "It's the way it feels. Like it matters again." I looked out at the land. "It does." She glanced over at me. "We've all been places we weren't supposed to survive." I met her eyes. "Same." Her jaw tightened slightly. "You lost everything too." My gaze stayed on the horizon. I lost what made me human for a while. She didn't speak again, but she didn't walk away either. We stayed there until the light was gone, the only sound the wind moving through the grass. Back at the cabin, Ren was asleep by the fire. Mika checked the traps near the barn. Sani left a tin of dried flowers on the table. Ayanna sat across from me at the hearth. The danger wasn't gone, but something stronger had taken its place. A sense that this was worth standing for, no matter what came next. The days after the standoff moved with a different weight. The usual sounds of the ranch water sloshing into troughs, the scrape of a shovel, the low murmur of the chickens were still there. But they carried a sharper edge. Every chore seemed to fold into the same purpose, making the place harder to take. Sani worked with her braid tucked up under a kerchief, hauling stones to brace the posts of the chicken coop. She set each one firm against the wood, testing it with her boot before moving on. Tula stayed near the barn, fitting a new brace across the window she'd reinforced before. She measured twice, cut once, and didn't waste a single nail. Mika and Ayanna took turns carrying buckets from the well, filling every barrel and trough until they overflowed. I spent the better part of the day in the root cellar, clearing the narrow back tunnel, my hands raw from shifting rock and dirt. Above, I could hear Ren moving between coop and porch, feeding the chickens and checking their nests without needing to be told. By midweek, the work stretched into new parts of the day. We cleared brush near the ridge, where a rider could approach unseen, piling it into low walls to block the view from the trail. Mika replaced the hinges on the barn doors with heavier ones, scavenged from an old wagon. Sani patched a seam in the roof using boiled tar until the board sealed tight. Tula took to setting small snares off the trail, checking them each morning and marking their spots in a way only she seemed to understand. One evening, the light was fading over the mesa when I saw Ayanna in the west field. Her hands in her pockets, looking out over the land. I walked out to stand beside her. The grass swayed in a slow wave under the breeze. "You've built something here," she said without turning. "Wasn't much before you came," I answered. She gave a short shake of her head. "It's not just the house or the fences. It's the way it feels. Like it matters again." I looked out past the fence line, the sun settling low. "It does." She glanced over at me. "We've all been places we weren't supposed to survive." I met her eyes briefly. Same. Her voice was quieter then. "You lost everything too." I kept my gaze on the land. "I lost what made me human for a while." She didn't reply, but she didn't walk away either. Inside the cabin had its own changes. Wren had started staying outside a little longer each evening, carrying small stones to line the edges of Sonny's garden rows. Mika checked the traps near the barn every night before the fire was banked. Tula found an old ledger in the cupboard and began recording weather repairs and what each snare caught. Sonny left a tin of dried flowers on the table one afternoon without explanation. One night after Wren had gone to bed and the others had settled into their own corners, Ayana sat at the table sharpening a blade. I was cleaning my rifle at the other end. "You think they'll come back?" she asked, eyes on the steel. I wiped the barrel once more before answering. Men like that don't like losing. Maybe they wait, maybe they don't. But they don't forget. She nodded. Then we keep ready. A few days later, I asked her something that had been sitting in my mind since they'd arrived. Why here there's other places closer to the trails? She was quiet for a long moment. We weren't heading for here. We were heading for water. Wren remembered this place from before. She came through with her mother 2 years ago. You left bread on a crate by the porch and went back inside. Said nothing. She never forgot. I remembered the scene 2 figures thin from the road, but not the girl's face. She said, "We should find that place again." When things got bad. Ayana finished. The following morning, Ayana and Sonny began clearing a larger patch of ground beside the barn. "A proper garden," Ayana said. Sonny stretched twine between stakes marking rows. I hauled water from the well, while Wren placed stones along the edge. It was the first time she stayed outside past dusk. By the time we stopped, the smell of turned earth hung in the cooling air. Later that week, we all sat on the porch with cornbread and coffee. The talk was easy scattered. Mika told a story about a trader falling off his mule, and Sonny nearly spilled her cup laughing. Ayana sat next to me, her legs stretched out, her mug balanced in one hand. "This might be the first time in my life no one's waiting to take something from me," she said. I looked at her, then out at the land. "No one's going to," I said. Her fingers brushed mine, light testing, but I didn't pull away. The moon was full when we banked the fire that night. The wind was soft against the walls, and the land felt still in a way it hadn't in weeks. We didn't know if the ridge would bring riders again, but the thought no longer carried the same weight. The ranch didn't feel like just a place to defend anymore. It was something we were building, and none of us seemed willing to let it go. It was near sundown when I saw the rider cutting across the far ridge. The light was low enough to throw him in shadow, but the way he sat the saddle told me he wasn't just passing through. I stepped off the porch, my boots sinking into the dry earth, and kept my eyes on him until he reached the bend in the trail. Ayana came out behind me, wiping her hands on her skirt. "You know him?" she asked. I shook my head. Not yet. By the time he pulled up in front of the porch, the horse's flanks were dark with sweat. The man tipped his hat and glanced past me toward the cabin. "Name's Deputy Frank Hollis," he said, voice even. "Sheriff sent me from Calhoun. You folks might be seeing trouble sooner than you think." We let him water his horse while he talked. Seems word had reached town that the men we'd run off before were gathering again, this time with more hands. Hollis leaned against the rail, his gaze sweeping the fence line. "They aim to come in from the south, not the ridge," he said. "Figure you'd be watching the same way they tried last time." Ayana crossed her arms. "How soon?" He adjusted his hat. "Could be days, could be tomorrow." After he left, the quiet felt heavier. We didn't waste time. Mika took Wren to the loft and showed her how to work the small crossbow she'd been mending. Sonny started hauling water to the new garden, but I saw she was also checking the snare lines between trips. Tula moved through the barn like a shadow, setting up a place to store extra feed and tools out of sight. That night, we gathered in the main room with a single lamp lit. I spread a rough map on the table marking the south approach with a charcoal line. "If they come this way, they'll have to cross the dry creek bed," I said. Ayana leaned over, tracing the line with her finger. That's narrow enough for a barricade. Mika nodded. We can drop timber there, slow them down. The next 2 days were a blur of work. We felled 3 pine trunks from the east slope, cutting and hauling them down with the mules. Tula and Sony sharpened the ends to drive into the creek bed. Ayana and I packed sandbags from the bank and stacked them waist-high behind the barricade. The sun was hard on our backs, but no one stopped until the work was done. Wren stayed close to me during those days, her small hands carrying nails or holding a lantern when the light began to fade. She didn't speak much, but her eyes followed everything. One evening, while we were walking back from the creek, she asked, "They won't get in, will they?" I kept my voice steady. "Not if we stand together." She nodded, gripping my hand tighter. On the 3rd morning, we spotted dust on the southern horizon. The air felt different, tight, waiting. We made our last checks in silence. Mika took the high ground with the crossbow. Sonny stayed near the cabin door, and Ayana stood with me behind the sandbags. We could hear the faint thud of hooves before we saw the riders. There were 6 of them this time, moving slow as if testing our nerve. The lead man reined up just outside the creek bed, scanning our position. "We're here for what's ours," he called. His voice carried across the open stretch. I stepped up beside the barricade. "Ain't nothing here for you," I said. He smirked. "Then you won't mind us looking." Ayana's voice cut the air. "You cross that creek, you won't be riding back." Something in her tone made the men shift in their saddles. The lead rider's grin faltered, but he didn't turn away. He nudged his horse forward, and the first hoof hit the sandbag line we'd buried shallow under the water's surface. The animal jerked back, almost throwing him. Mika's bolt hit the ground a foot from his stirrup. The standoff held for a long moment, the only sound the wind moving through the grass. Finally, the lead rider pulled his horse around. "This ain't over," he called, and they turned back the way they'd come. We stood still until the dust faded. That night, the cabin was quiet but not heavy. The barricade still stood, and so did we. I banked the fire slow, knowing the next move might come soon, but also knowing we'd be ready when it did. The morning after the standoff, the air felt cleaner, though I knew it wouldn't last. I was out by the corral, mending a loose rail, when Ayana stepped out of the cabin with a folded scrap of paper in her hand. "This came with the supply wagon from Calhoun," she said, passing it to me. The paper was creased and worn from travel. It bore Sheriff McClure's seal, and a few blunt lines. The men who'd been harassing us had been spotted meeting with a rancher named Clay Rourke, a man known for stirring trouble on both sides of the county line. I'd heard the name before. Rourke owned a spread south of the Mesquite Hills, and he had a habit of hiring riders who'd been run out of other towns. If he was backing them now, the trouble was about to grow teeth. By midday, Deputy Hollis returned dust on his hat brim, and his horse lathered from the ride. "It's worse than we figured," he said, swinging down. "Rourke's offered them pay and shelter. Says they'll clear you out before the month's end." We gathered at the long table inside. Hollis laid out a hand-drawn map showing Rourke's ranch and the trails leading to ours. "They'll likely ride at night," he said. "And they won't come in a straight line." Mika leaned forward. "Then we need to be ready on all sides." The next days were a steady grind. We split into pairs. Ayana and Tula reinforced the barn doors with cross planks. Mika and Sonny dug shallow trenches near the north fence, and I worked with Hollis setting trip lines across the western approach. Wren stayed close to the cabin, helping with small tasks, but always watching. On the 4th night, just past midnight, the first warning came, a sharp clatter from the west, where one of the trip lines had been strung. Hollis was at the door in seconds, rifle in hand. I followed the cold air biting my face. We saw 3 riders in the dim moonlight, moving slow and silent, until the trip line sent one of their horses rearing. The man fell hard, cursing as he scrambled up. Hollis fired a warning shot that cracked across the open ground. The riders pulled back without a word, vanishing into the dark. Come morning, we found fresh tracks circling wide to the south. They were testing us, looking for a weak place. The barricade at the creek still stood, but the ground on either side was churned from their passing. That evening, we set more traps and doubled the watch. Ayanna took the first shift on the porch with her rifle across her knees. I sat inside near the door listening to the quiet. Near dawn, hoofbeats came fast and hard. This time it was more than a scouting party, half a dozen riders charging the creek. Mika's crossbow sang, and Hollis's rifle answered. The barricade held horses, shying at the sandbags and sharpened stakes. 2 men went down hard. The rest wheeled away, leaving them behind. When it was over, Hollis crossed the creek to collect their weapons. "They'll be back," he said, his voice flat. "But not tonight." We buried the lightest stakes back into place, knowing each day bought us more time. Rourke's men were stubborn, but so were we. As the sun dropped, a lone rider appeared on the ridge. He didn't come close, just sat there watching. Then he turned and rode off toward the Mesquite Hills. I didn't say anything, but I knew it in my bones the next time they came. It wouldn't be a probe. It would be the fight Rourke had promised. The rider on the ridge had been a warning. 2 nights later, they came in force. Hoofbeats pounded against the hard earth, carrying shouts and the metallic clatter of rifles. The moonlight caught the glint of steel as Rourke's men swept toward the creek. We were ready. Hollis and I took the north line. Mika and Sonny guarded the south, while Ayanna and Tula stayed near the cabin to protect Wren. The barricade at the creek forced their charge into the narrow gap we'd left open on purpose. When the first riders pushed through the trip lines, caught them sending horses stumbling and men sprawling. Gunfire split the night. I could feel the vibration of each shot in my chest. Hollis's rifle cracked steady and sure. Mika's arrows sang past, and in minutes the push faltered. Those still upright tried to turn back, but more of our traps waited in the dark. By the time the dust settled, the men still able to ride were fleeing toward the Mesquite Hills, leaving the rest behind. When it was over, we gathered in the pale light of dawn. Hollis checked the wounded men, binding what he could before leading them to town for the sheriff to handle. Rourke himself had stayed well clear of the fight, sending others to do his work. But by midday, word came over the telegraph. Sheriff McClure had a signed order from the circuit judge seizing Rourke's land for illegal use. Justice, slow though it had finally caught up. That evening, we sat around the table in the cabin, the lamplight warm against tired faces. The air smelled faintly of coffee and wood smoke. No one spoke for a long while, and it wasn't an uneasy silence. It was the kind that comes when folks know they've stood their ground and kept what mattered. In the weeks that followed, life steadied. The fences were mended, the barn doors re-hung, and the fields tilled for spring planting. Hollis returned to his post in town, though he promised to ride out often. Mika and Sonny stayed through the season, helping with the work, and Ayanna, well, she became as much a part of the place as the land itself. I'd once thought this stretch of country was too hard, too lonely to hold on to. But the truth was, it had given me something I hadn't found anywhere else: a family, even if we weren't bound by blood. We'd face the dust, the cold, and the greed of men who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. And we'd met it together. Now, when I look out over the corral at sunset, the sky painted in gold and deep rose, I remember that night and know the fight was worth it. Out here, you can't choose the trials that come, but you can choose who you stand with. And sometimes that makes all the difference. If you've walked a hard trail yourself, maybe you know what I mean. Hold on to the ones who stand beside you. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who could use a reminder that even in the roughest country, good folks can still make a home.